Picture this. India's biggest companies are sitting on a cash mountain worth 5 trillion rupees. That's roughly $60 billion. Enough money to India's entire defense budget for a year. But here's the puzzle that's got economists scratching their heads. Instead of using this money to build new factories, hire more workers, or expand their businesses, these companies are just hoarding it, like digital age dragons sitting on treasure troves. Hi, I'm Abhinaba Saha, means Senior Markets Correspondent, and today we are diving into one of the biggest economic puzzles facing India right now. Why are profitable companies choosing financial safety over growth? And what does this mean for India's dream of becoming a $5 trillion economy? Let's start with the numbers, because they're frankly staggering. According to our analysis of 285 major Indian companies listed on the Bombay Stock Exchange, cash holdings jumped 12% in the fiscal year 2025 alone, reaching 5 trillion rupees. But here's what makes this really remarkable. These cash reserves have been growing at 10% annually, nearly twice as fast as their debt, which grew just above 5.5%. This isn't just about having emergency funds. This represents a fundamental shift in how Indian businesses think about money. Companies now hold nearly 12% of their total assets in cash or cash equivalents. To put this in perspective, that's like a person keeping 12% of everything of their own, their houses, cars, investments, just sitting in a checking account. The trend is so pronounced that over 300 companies became completely debt-free in FY25, collectively doubling their cash reserves to over 50,000 crores rupees. We're witnessing the corporate equivalent of extreme penny pinching, but on a scale that could reshape India's entire economy. Now you might think, well, maybe companies are just being smart with their money. But here's where it gets concerning. While cash piles grew, new project announcements actually dropped 5% in fiscal 2025. This followed a 3% decline the previous year. According to the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, private sector capital expenditure, that's spending on new factories, equipment and infrastructure, is expected to fall 25% in fiscal 2026 compared to the previous year. This is particularly puzzling because capacity utilization in Indian industries reached around 77%, the highest in 11 years. Normally when companies are using 3/4 of their production capacity, they start building more, but not this time. Historically, when businesses approach 75% capacity utilization, they trigger new investment cycles. It's like a restaurant that's constantly full, you'd expect them to open a second location. But Indian companies are choosing to stay put despite having the cash to expand. So why are profitable companies with healthy balance sheets acting like they're preparing for economic winter? The answer lies in a perfect storm of uncertainty. First, there's global chaos. From Trump's tariff wars to the Russian-Ukraine conflict, businesses are facing what experts call an unprecedented uncertainty. Companies like Reliance and Tata are watching supply chains getting disrupted and trade routes get reshuffled. It's not just global factors though. Domestically, consumer demand has been surprisingly weak. Major companies from Unilever to Maruti have reported declining revenues, as urban consumers, that's around 522 million of us, have cut back on spending. This creates what economists call a demand investment nexus. Companies won't invest in new capacity if they don't see customers lining up to buy their products. It's a rational response, but it creates a vicious cycle as well. There's also policy uncertainty. Despite government efforts like production-linked incentive schemes, only 15% of eligible companies have participated. Many are waiting to see how trade negotiations with countries like the US pan out, especially with tariff disruptions hanging in the balance. While companies won't spend on growth, they are being surprisingly generous with shareholders. Dividend payouts from BSE 500 companies rose 11% to almost 5 trillion rupees in FY25, the highest in a decade. Here's the kicker though. This dividend growth of 11% actually exceeded the net profit growth of 9.5%. It's like companies are literally paying out more than their profit growth would justify. This puts Indian companies at an extreme end globally. According to NYU's Ashwath Damodaran, Indian firms returned just around 31% of their earnings to shareholders in 2024, the lowest globally. But the trend is accelerating, suggesting a shift from reinvestment to distribution. The message is clear. If we can't find good places to invest this money, we'll give it back to our owners. It's financially rational for individual companies, but potentially problematic for the broader economy. This cash hoarding isn't happening in isolation though. India's economic growth has slowed to 6.5% in FY25, the slowest in 4 years. While that's still healthy by global standards, it's well below the 7 to 8% mark. India needs to create enough jobs for its young population. The lack of corporate investment is creating a self-reinforcing problem. Without new factories and expansion, job creation slows. Without more jobs, wages stagnate. Without rising wages, consumer demand stays weak. And without strong demand, companies won't invest. It's an economic catch-22. The government is trying to fill the gap though, setting a capital expenditure budget of 11.4 lakh crores with heavy focus on roads and railways. But government spending, while important, can't be a substitute for the efficiency and dynamism that private investment bring. This has serious implications for India's $5 trillion economy target. With corporate investment stalled and consumption weak, achieving this ambitious goal becomes significantly harder. The private sector, which is one of the growth engines of the economy, is instead acting as a brake. So when will this investment drought end? Experts point to several key factors that could unlock corporate spending. First, monetary policy. The Reserve Bank of India has already cut rates by 100 basis points over 3 meetings, and further cuts could make borrowing more attractive for expansion. Lower rates typically encourage investment over cash hoarding. Second, more global clarity. Many companies are waiting for clear signals on US trade policy, particularly around tariffs. The recent imposition of 50% tariffs on Indian exports has created additional uncertainty. But a negotiated solution could restore more confidence. Third, domestic revival. Signs of improving employment and wage growth could trigger the virtuous cycle and get companies investing again. Consumer demand is ultimately what drives business confidence. And finally, structural reforms. Improvements in land acquisition, labor laws, and regulatory clarity could reduce the perceived risk of large-scale investments. India Inc.'s 5 trillion rupee cash pile tells a story of corporate caution in uncertain times. While individual companies are acting rationally by preserving cash and rewarding shareholders, collectively this behavior threatens India's growth trajectory. The challenge of policymakers is clear thus. How do you restore business confidence and trigger the investment cycle that India desperately needs? Because until companies start believing in the future again, all that cash will remain locked away, a symbol of potential lost and unrealized. The question isn't whether Indian companies can afford to invest. With 5 trillion in cash, they clearly can. The question is whether they will. And for India's economic future, the answer to that question could make all the difference.